Welcome back. Today we are going to be wrapping up this third section of the course, Sustainability Across Time and Through Space, looking at different case studies of how different societies have interacted with their environment and resource base throughout time. And what can we learn from these societies? There's many examples of sustainable long-term resource use. What can we learn from that? The way we do things today is not inevitable or set in stone. It's culturally specific. Before getting into the material, which I don't have a lot of new stuff for you today, but it should help solidify some of the things we've talked about. Before getting into that, just a reminder, we have our second exam coming up this Thursday. It'll be available by 5 p.m. Thursday, and you have until the following Sunday, April 19th, until the end of the day, 11:59 p.m., to take it. So make sure you prepare in advance, study ahead of time before you begin because you'll only have one attempt to take it. The format's similar to our first exam in class, 35 to 40 multiple choice questions worth 70% of the score, and one essay question worth 30% of the score. One really key change this time, and I hope this is helpful to you all, that's why I'm doing it, is I've told you which essay question is gonna be on the exam. It's number 2, I believe. You should reference the study guide to see which question will be on the test. I strongly urge you to prepare your answer to this question in advance. Then during the exam, you can type your response right into the exam. Because you're writing from home, because you're taking the exam from home, it's by definition open book because I have no way to monitor that. So you can use your book, your notes, your study guide, but you won't have time to search for the answers while you're taking the test. It's a timed test. So again, prepare and study in advance before you begin. And especially the essay question. Get that puppy ready before you start the test. That way you've got 30% of the exam nailed. I really urge you to take advantage of this. Even though only that one question is going to be on the exam as an essay, the rest of the essay questions on the study guide are going to help you prepare for the multiple choice. Again, I can't stress this enough. Be sure to use your own words on the essay. The rule of thumb is 3 or more words in a row that are not your own is considered plagiarism. So don't do it. Be really careful about this. Just put the information in your own words. You have time to do this in advance. The essay question study guide's up on Blackboard. Again, prep your answer ahead of time. I'm telling you what the question is. So no surprises there. And then review the material, to go through the lectures and your notes. Make sure you've done the readings and the reading questions. You shouldn't have to go back and redo that. And films are all fair game too. If you have questions, get in touch with me, email or the discussion board, or depending on student demand, maybe we can even set up a Zoom study session. So stay in touch with me if you're struggling or you have questions. All right, so the exam's gonna be Thursday. It'll be available at 5. And today is the last bit of material you're responsible for for the exam. So everything from the first exam up until today is fair game for exam 2. This is all on the study guide also. Okay, so just to recap where we left off, you've seen this before, different forms of environmental management and manipulation. There's on the large scale, environmental manipulation. This is the physical alteration of species and ecosystems on a large scale. The rice terracing in Bali is a good example of large scale environmental manipulation. And then there's smaller scale management of specific resources. For example, you've been reading about in Ben Orlov about the lakeshore villages around Lake Titicaca. They are an example of smaller scale resource management. They manage the fisheries, the fish populations in the lake that are near their territory. We'll talk more at the end of the lecture about them. And there's 2 general forms of environmental management, active and passive. So remember, all societies, not just large-scale industrial developed societies like our own, but all societies, small and large scale, manipulate and have manipulated their environments. Active forms of management include things like burning, slash and burn cultivation, clearing land for planting, cultivation without clearing land, also constructed landscapes like the Balinese rice terraces. The most common form of active management is burning, sort of slash and burn, you can see on the top photo on the slide. And then there's passive management. So active management is done to intentionally modify the environment, the resource base, to make it more productive for human subsistence. Passive is different in the sense that advantageous effects on the environment that help maintain a balance between the society and the environment so that they continue to rely on those resources come from the religion or ceremonies and rituals. And so it's indirect, it's passive in the sense that through practicing things related to their belief system, these ceremonies and rituals, it indirectly has advantages for the environment and the resource base. The example, I really only gave you one solid example of passive management, and that was the Balinese rice farmers. The water rituals and the timing of irrigation is tied to their religion, the water goddess and the water temples. The timing, however, of the rituals and the way that it affects the irrigation results in this staggering of different farmers watering their fields in subex, and it has all these beneficial effects. There's enough water, it controls for pests, it does all these other things. And so it's passive in the sense that the religion, the ceremonies aren't done directly to manage the subsistence base, but indirectly they have beneficial effects. And in general, societies that tend to rely directly on their environments for subsistence, it tends to generate beliefs and behaviors that don't cause wholesale destruction of the environment. And so we left off last time talking about subsistence in the Amazon. And the key question we started with was, how did Amazonians produce enough food to support large, complex societies? So remember, archaeologist Betty Meggers made this argument that in the Amazon, because of limited agricultural potential, no complex societies had developed here. She ultimately was wrong about this, but her argument was complex society was unable to develop in the Amazon because you can't practice intensive agriculture here. Even though it looks lush and tropical, it's a counterfeit paradise because you can't actually grow crops in the soil. The trees that grow in the tropics are adapted to this environment, and so their roots shoot out in broad, shallow layers to absorb nutrients before they even enter the soil. Because in the tropics, the heat and the moisture material decomposes so quickly that, and then the rainfall is so high that the nutrients and minerals, once they enter the soil, they are leached out by the high amount of rainfall, making them inaccessible to the plants. And so trees there have actually adapted to this. Their roots grow out so they catch the nutrients before they even enter the soil. So you can't practice intensive agriculture here, and that's true because of soil leaching and high rainfall. She suggests maybe societies may have been practicing slash and burn, but now recent evidence shows that this is probably not likely. So if you go to the Amazon today, contemporary societies are these sort of smaller scale horticulturalists practicing slash and burn agriculture, supplementing that with hunting and fishing. That's what it looks like today, which is one of the reasons she said the Amazon can't support large complex societies, because we don't see any there today, unlike the Maya and the Inca and the Aztecs that are nearby. But they couldn't have practiced slash and burn pre-Columbian, pre-colonial times, because you can't support large populations with slash and burn. You need too much land to leave fallow to let it regenerate before you can grow on that plot again. It requires too much land, too much extensification to support large populations. And also the consensus is now slash and burn wouldn't have been a viable technology before the introduction of European steel. And so the consensus now is slash and burn is a more recent innovation in the Amazon. It's post-colonialism due to old world diseases, which depopulated the area, which is why we see smaller populations there today, and the introduction of steel, which made slash and burn viable compared to using stone tools. But evidence still shows that the Amazon indeed did support large complex societies. So how were they doing it? It wasn't intensive agriculture. It wasn't slash and burn. And the answer seems to be what's called a domesticated landscape. The people, ancient Amazonians, purposely modified their environment, their landscapes, to make them more congenial to human purposes. Two examples I gave you of domesticated landscapes. One was managed forests. So instead of clearing the forest, they would replace the species that were growing there with species useful to humans. The specific example I gave you was of the peach palm. Excellent resource. It has protein, high caloric oil, nutrients, minerals it produces 5 years after you plant it, up to 70 years. And so if you look at the Amazon today, over half actually of the natural ecologically occurring species are used by humans for food or other uses. And that's a lot more than we would expect by chance. So they intentionally modified their environments on a large scale. They replaced the species that were growing with species useful to them, managed forests. The other example of a domesticated landscape I gave you was something called Amazonian dark earth, or synonymous with terra preta do Indio, which means black earth of the Indian in Portuguese. And so the terra preta is this really rich, fertile soil, teeming with nutrients and carbon and phosphorus and nitrogen in much higher levels when compared to the typical oxisol acidic soil of the Amazon. And the way scientists think ancient Amazonians, and we also find terra preta or dark earth in West Africa, the way scientists now think that it was created was through something called slash and smolder, or slash and char agriculture. So in contrast to slash and burn, you don't chop everything down and then burn it into ash and incorporate the ash into the soil. You can grow for a few seasons and then you need to let fertility restore. With slash and char, you don't burn the vegetation all the way into ash, which releases the bulk of the carbon into the atmosphere. Instead, you char it. You turn it into charcoal. The effect is most of the carbon is then locked into the burnt vegetation in the biochar into a bioavailable form for plants. So it's not released into the atmosphere, it's retained in the charcoal in the soil. And the other effect, another effect of the charcoal is there's high rainfall creating leaching of nutrients. Well, charcoal, when it's incorporated into the soil, it holds a lot of these nutrients and microorganisms in sort of the pores of the charcoal, so they don't get leached out by the high rainfall. So you've got this black, rich, fertile soil with charcoal incorporated that keeps all these nutrients and microorganisms in it. When you compare yields off plants grown in the acidic Amazon soil versus the terra preta, I mean, it's something like the yields for maize are 60 times higher in terra preta, biodiversity is 11 times higher. It's just immense, the difference between the two soils. Extremely rich, fertile, great for growing crops. And so these ancient Amazonian societies, they modified their landscapes on a large scale. Again, plant inventories show half of all ecologically occurring species in the Amazon are used by humans for food. Up to 20%, up to a fifth of the Amazon rainforest might be anthropogenic, meaning human created, human modified. It would not look like that if humans had not impacted that environment. And pre-Columbian Amazonian Indians made their own fertile soil. Up to 10% of Amazonia consists of these patches of terra preta. Up to a tenth of the Amazon. That's huge. One of the key questions is, were these practices by ancient Amazonians intentional? Were they doing this intentionally for conservation? And so, was it active, intentional, or passive? And the distinction becomes kind of blurred. So what I'll say is intentional management was definitely going on. People are not ignorant of the effects that these techniques have. They're doing it on purpose to make their environment more conducive to producing food for them. So they are intentionally managing the environment. But they're not doing it intentional for the purpose of conservation, right? Like the World Wildlife Fund maybe would do. However, the fact that these societies, again, depend more directly on their immediate environment, it tends in this passive way to generate beliefs and behaviors that don't create environmental destruction, but rather a balance. Because detrimental impacts on the environment, that's their subsistence base. They can no longer survive if that starts happening, so they can react to that. So they're managing their environments not with the goal, the sort of existential goal of conservation, but managing them for subsistence, and indirectly, passively so, it tends to result in a more sustainable system because they rely on their environment and because they can see the immediate impact of their actions and respond to that. And so, what is the Amazon forest? It's nature at its finest, right? It's the fucking rainforest. It's pristine. It has rivers, high biodiversity. It's a jungle, right? Sort of the opposite of urban civilization. So what I want you to do real quick is go ahead and type the URL on the slide into your computer and watch a quick clip. It's by the World Wildlife Fund, one of the major non-government organizations, NGOs involved in conservation work around the world, right? Saving nature, if you will. So go ahead, pause the lecture, pop the URL into your browser and watch this quick clip. It's less than a minute and 30 seconds. And then come back to lecture. And while you're watching the clip, note down what the WWF is showing you. How are they portraying the Amazon? What is in the Amazon? So go ahead, pause lecture, watch the clip. It's a minute, 27 seconds, and then come back to lecture. Okay, so Norm, if we were in class, my question would be to you all, what is missing from the World Wildlife Fund's portrayal of the Amazon? What is not included in this environment, in this ecosystem, even though it's an integral part of it, even though the Amazon wouldn't look this way without this piece of the ecosystem? And the answer to what's missing in the video is people, the people that actually live in these environments, the human populations. And again, this is the WWF, their introduction to the rainforest. It's one of the biggest conservation organizations. And when the Amazon and other areas get portrayed like this as empty of humans, it helps perpetuate, perhaps unintentionally, it helps perpetuate the notion that humans are separate and not part of nature. And also this notion that therefore they are the problem, right? If we want to keep nature, we got to keep people out of it. This is the assumption. But as the evidence shows, these ancient Amazonian societies we've been talking about, that we talked about last lecture, they actually adapted and indeed created nature. What many see as nature is in fact anthropogenic, human modified. 20% of the Amazon, anthropogenic. Another 30% really if you count terra preta. And it's interesting because, I mean, the rainforest to Western civilization, it's almost symbolic to many of us of what is nature and what is not nature. Even though, again, it wouldn't look like this if humans had not been a part of it. So what about the concept of nature? Last lecture, I asked you to define for me what is nature. And so let's talk about that for a minute. Many of you jumped on the Blackboard discussion board and contributed to the conversation. What is nature? You gave me a definition or an explanation. A great job. Well done. And you can still contribute up until Friday if you want. Jump on the discussion board. If you do, read through what's been said already. It should help solidify the point that's being made here. And then add to what's been said. Don't just sort of post what's already been said if you do want to contribute. And so what is nature? And think about it. I didn't give you a whole lot of information. 3 words. What is nature? I didn't really give you a whole lot to go on, but I got lots of different answers from people. We all sort of know what it is, yet every definition for the most part was slightly different. Why is this? So let's just talk some of the main points that came out of the discussion. Some of you sort of said nature is everything, and you went into really articulate descriptions of physical, biological systems, etc. One sort of critique, playing devil's advocate, is if we're defining nature as everything, are we defining anything? If you define something as everything, what are you actually defining? Another sort of main theme that came out of the discussion responses was a big theme was humans are less natural. There was different variations of this. Some would say humans are not part of nature. Some said humans are part of nature. We come from the earth and so do our activities. But some types of human activity is more or less natural, if you will. So for example, one of you referenced the Anthropocene, and everything that's come after the Anthropocene, which started with the Industrial Revolution, is not natural. So what about before the Anthropocene? What about foragers like the Kung or the Inuit? Are they part of nature? And then sort of all societies after that Anthropocene are not, like large scale industrial societies that we're used to? Or what about farming societies like the Maya or the Balinese rice farmers? Are these humans or cultures sort of more or less natural? I mean, you could argue that, like in Bali, they're not having a degrading effect on their environment. Um, or is it all humans and human activity that's outside of nature? Where do we draw the line with this? For those that see humans and all things that stem from us as less natural to varying degrees, then under this definition of humans not part of nature, what is the Amazon rainforest then? Therefore it can't be considered part of nature because it's anthropogenic, it's human created in part. Large portions of it are modified, anthropogenic, would not look like that without human activity. How does this change our understanding of the Amazon rainforest? Or how does our discussion on the Amazon and why it looks the way it does inform Western cultural assumptions about what nature is? I would propose one reason why you all came up with largely some similarities, but also lots of different definitions. Why can't we define it? And I would suggest that's because nature is more, in our culture, it's an idea. It's a social construction, not a thing, not really an objective thing. I mean, it kind of is in a way because we all sort of know it when we see it versus when we see a piece of styrofoam, but yet we can't come down on a definition. If it was a thing, an objective thing, we should all be able to define it and define it similarly. But we can't. And again, I would suggest that's because it's sort of an idea that we ascribe to things rather than an actual thing. Is the Amazon natural? I guess that's a matter of perspective. It's not natural if you see humans as separate from nature, but it is natural if you see humans as a part of it. The Amazon's a human modified landscape, and it's not just the Amazon. This is true for regions all over the world. We dichotomize nature, nature and what is not nature. But this dichotomy is somewhat subjective and therefore constructed. But interestingly, at the same time, even though I didn't ask you much, I didn't give you a definition. My question was really short. I said, what is nature? Many of you all sort of hit on similar themes. We all, in other words, have an idea of what it is. And many of us care about it. We like nature. And many of us also see humans as the problem with it, as in conflict with it. And so one of the main reasons we're talking about this, it's interesting just to question our own assumptions, right? You've always known your whole life what nature is, supposedly. People's subjective notions about what nature is becomes really, really important when we start talking about Western conservation initiatives that seek to save and protect nature from people. In the result of this type of thinking and these assumptions built into it about what nature is and what it needs to be protected from, the result is that indigenous groups have been kicked out of their own environments in the name of keeping nature safe and untouched. Even though, again, those environments look that way often because of the humans that have long inhabited them. If this doesn't make sense now, it will when we get into conservation policy after the exam. And so how does this understanding of nature, this discussion, shape our views of small scale societies? And again, even if you didn't contribute to the discussion board, you still can. And I would look through it all anyways, because it should help illuminate what we're talking about here. So how does this view of nature, what we just talked about, shape our understanding of small scale societies? And typically Western society often sees indigenous groups, simple societies, as merely living within the constraints of their environment, just making do with what nature provides them. Right? The Native Americans used every piece of the buffalo. We mythologize about it, sometimes erroneously, that people, simple societies lived in nature. They made do with nature. And it gets back to this common misconception that people either live within nature or they destroy it. And there's sort of no in between. But as we've looked at the evidence of large-scale complex societies and these anthropogenic earthworks in the Amazon, the evidence shows small-scale societies were shaped by their environments, they adapted to their environments, but they also in turn largely shaped their environments, modified them. They were not necessarily at the mercy of what nature may or may not provide. They modified, manipulated, managed their environments on a large scale. 30% of the Amazon is anthropogenic. And so humans actually have a role in biodiversity, and in many cases, they have helped create it. And this sort of changes our typical understanding of non-industrial small-scale societies. Again, in Western culture, we typically see them as living with nature, merely making do, rather than actually mutually influencing it and creating it. That's reserved only for large industrial developed societies, right? We're the ones that destroy nature. So you either live within it or you destroy it like we do. And those are that's sort of the way it's seen. The Western world often sees it as, again, people don't really affect the environment. They sort of live in it, this ecologically noble savage, or they destroy it. And in fact, right, what many people label as nature, like the Amazon rainforest, this is actually created by people. So are people therefore necessarily the problem with human impact on the environment? Is it all people? Is it human nature? No. And cross-culturally, we can see that. It's certain types of human behavior that are the problem, that cause the deteriorating impact, right? Human destruction of the environment is not a universal trait. It is culturally specific. So how do Western civilizations, Western societies tend to view the natural environment? And there's sort of two main views I'll highlight for you. The first is this idea that the natural environment must be conquered. It's dangerous, it's savage, it's beautiful, but again, savage and dangerous. We have to sort of conquer it, master it. And then there's this other view that nature is something that needs to be protected, conserved, kept free from human impact. This idea of lovely nature or the rainforest, which is sort of a nicer word for jungle or green hell, which were the initial terms. In both of these views, that the environment, that nature is something to either conquer or to conserve, come from the same historical development, essentially beginning with European exploration and colonialism. People started traveling over to Africa, and travelers, explorers, colonists, they produced this image of wild Africa and these uninhabited landscapes, beautiful but also dangerous. And so the jungle is sort of untamed, apart from civilization, and also simultaneously this virgin land that has been unsullied by human hands. These are sort of the two main views. And both stem from European contact and colonialism and movement into Africa, where it looked to them, at least in some cases, that it wasn't really inhabited. But that's because the groups and cultures living there, the impact they're having on their environment, it doesn't look like what Europeans were doing to their environment. So it wasn't really recognized that they were indeed part of those ecosystems and environments. So first, this green hell or jungle outlook. And this is really prominent in literature and film, older film. This idea that nature has to be conquered. It's dangerous, it's savage. It poses a challenge to people, right? There's dangerous animals, poisonous snakes, all this other stuff that can kill you. It's outside of civilization. It's dangerous, wild, untamed. Think the Jungle Book, right? Little boy raised in the wilderness on the outskirts of civilization. And so this idea that the natural environment poses a challenge, that it's dangerous, leads to the notion that these natural environments need to be tamed, managed, controlled by humans. either to protect us or so that humans or man may use nature's resources. This kind of thinking is also prominent in certain evangelical sects, right? That sort of say, well, God gave man the earth and it's here for us, so use it, abuse it. It doesn't matter. We're not going to be here that long anyways. We're just waiting for sort of heaven on earth to happen. And again, I mentioned it, it's a good example of how ideology, what people think about the world, nature, humans' place in it, and how ideology can drive behavior and impact on the environment. So this type of thinking has led to this type of action. We need to control it, keep it at bay, manage it so that we can use it and stay safe from it. And then the other sort of thread, which is nature is something that needs to be protected, conserved. It's lovely, it's beautiful, it's the rainforest, right? Again, rainforest is the new term for jungle. Jungle has more of a negative connotation, if you will. It comes from this idea that rainforests and these virgin landscapes, these wild landscapes, are wild, virgin, unsullied by human hands. And again, it sort of looked like that to some Europeans, uninhabited, because other cultures' interactions and the way they modify their environment, it doesn't look like the way Europeans were modifying and destroying their environment. So it wasn't really noticed by the colonizers that these landscapes were indeed anthropogenic. And not to mention, protecting their own landscapes in Europe was something that was far out of reach by that point. They'd already destroyed their own wilderness where they live. And so this type of thinking, this rainforest, something to conserve, to protect, has led to conservation ethics without people included. Because people are seen as the problem, they are not part of nature, and therefore if we're going to protect it, we got to keep them out. The result of this is traditional resource users, indigenous groups, have all of a sudden been deemed poachers, even arrested, kicked out of their own traditional land and put in jail for hunting, as they always have for the past several thousand, tens of thousands of years. Traditional resource users and hunters are now poachers, and traditional settlers are now considered squatters in these different conservation areas that have been set up by outsiders and governments and people coming in and imposing on the local groups. And the local group, the people they're kicking out, are usually not the ones degrading the environment, right? Most of these inhabitants, these indigenous groups, have long interacted sustainably with their environment, right? They are not the problem. It is certain types of sociocultural organization that are a problem, and namely that of the Western capital commercial world, not small-scale indigenous societies. There's a book I'll reference here in a moment that touches on this notion of how this idea we need to protect it has led to conservation without people. And this actually has not been good for conservation, because if you take people out of an ecosystem that they're part of, that can have unintended consequences. And it's also disenfranchised and marginalized the victims of this progress, right? The people that actually traditionally have lived in these areas. Just a couple of quotes from this book about this idea, this called The Myth of Wild Africa, because Africa is not wild in the sense of untouched by humans. Human populations have been interacting and modifying Africa for over 2 million years. And so just a couple of quotes from that book, and I'll reference it here again in a minute. Countless African societies historically coexisted successfully with wild animals. But throughout the last 2 centuries, they've been perceived as threats. African hunters have been branded poachers. The irony is that these traditional resource users are generally not the threat, rather the outsiders, of whom many have already destroyed much of their pristine nature at home. The outsiders are the threat. Logging and mining companies, fishing industries, sport hunters. And this outlook also emphasizes that biodiversity, the flora, the fauna, is more important than human needs. And many of you might say off the bat, oh, good, fuck humans. But when we say human, we don't just mean large-scale, industrial, developed societies. We mean all humans, the small-scale, indigenous ones that have not had a detrimental impact on their environment. Human does not just mean large-scale industrial cultures. It also means small-scale indigenous ones. And many could argue that these groups, these indigenous groups, have lived sustainably in their environments for a long time. Nonetheless, this hasn't really been recognized in the majority of the history of conservation. People were seen as the problem, and therefore the solution is kick the people out to protect nature. Even though some of these natural landscapes and environments, these wild landscapes that we're protecting with national parks, look the way they do because they were inhabited by humans. They are actually anthropogenic. Just to tie something in, this is coffee from McDonald's. And so don't worry, McDonald's is helping to save the rainforest. Every time you buy a cup of their coffee, you're helping also because they contribute to the Rainforest Alliance. Lots of companies actually are solving our problems with the rainforest. By buying their products, you're helping to solve the problem too. It's a wonder we even have a problem with the environment, given how many people are helping. What is this an example that we have talked about in class? And the answer is this sort of Rainforest Alliance certified on the McCafe cup. This is what we call the individualization of responsibility for environmental problems. The individualization of responsibility is the default frame for solving environmental issues. It's the go-to solution. You can use less, reduce, reuse, buy this, do that, you, and we need to make all these changes. Individual actions do matter, but the majority of the problem, the majority of the barriers to becoming more sustainable do not lie with individuals. They lie with the structural barriers, corporations, the way the system is set up. So I just wanted to note this because this individualization of responsibility, the default frame, the go-to for solving our environmental problems, which overlooks the majority of our problems, is going to keep coming back up, especially towards the end of the class. And we might do a little extra credit project with it too. So start looking for examples of this. It's all around you. Okay, and so both of these Western urban views on the environment, either that it's a jungle and it needs to be conquered, or it's a rainforest, nature, and it needs to be protected. Both of these views are based on a couple of assumptions. First, to conquer and conserve are actually closely related. They're based off this assumption about nature, namely this assumption that nature is pristine, it's wild, it's untouched by humans. The assumption that the Amazon is a timeless and untouched landscape. It's pristine, it's unspoiled, it's original, unchanged. And as we know now, this is not true. It's actually anthropogenic. So the assumption that nature is untouched, and that's really what it's defined by. And another common assumption about the human-environment relationship. And this assumption is that humans are somehow not part of nature. We are apart from it. We're not part of it. And think about it. We do this all the time. I want to get out into nature. We are destroying nature. We should become more in tune with nature as if it's the separate thing that we are not a part of. This common Western conception of the environment results in the idea that the biophysical world, this idea that humans are not part of it, results in the idea that the biophysical world is something to either conquer, to control and use, or to conserve. But either way, we can't be a part of it or we'll be ruining it. Humans aren't part of it, therefore they're seen as the problem. They get them out of the natural environment. People ruin it, right? That was actually in a lot of your answers on the Blackboard discussion too. And so one of the reasons this is so important, and this is where we're going after the exam, is conservation policy, conservation efforts, and really the history of conservation has rested on building barriers between wild nature and humans in order to protect nature. Why is this problematic given what we've learned? Right? And the answer is it's based off what many would argue is a flawed assumption that humans are somehow not part of nature. They are. Humans are and have long been. We're not talking about just large-scale Western society. We're talking about all humans. It's not humans per se that degrade and destroy the environment. If you take an anthropological perspective, you look cross-culturally at the examples, it shows that this is not true. It's not humans in general that universally destroy environments. Several societies have existed sustainably with their environments throughout time and space. It's not humans or human nature. It's the specific type of sociocultural organization, the way the politics are organized, the economy is structured, what's the ideology and the values of the people, right? Do they see nature as something that was given to them by God or something that they're part of? What's the ideology, the values? It's the culture that determines the environmental impact. in both degree and kind. Humans per se are not the problem. It is the particular sociocultural organization that generates the detrimental impacts. This notion that humans are part of and even the cause of some environmental landscapes, this falls under the field called historical ecology. So historical ecology emerges sort of in the middle of the 20th century in response to some of the things that were going on in ecology at the time. One thing is ecologists were largely studying ecology without humans as part of it. We are in the fucking Anthropocene. Humans are affecting every ecosystem almost on Earth. To try to study ecology without accounting for human influence, that's not even science. And so human ecology, historical ecology, emerge in response to this. And they say you can't study just the ecology or the social system. You have to understand the mutual interaction between the two. So historical ecologists then, they focus on the interaction between humans and the environment over long periods of time, typically centuries. And they don't concentrate just on the environment, the ecology, or the social system. They want to understand the interaction of the two throughout space and time and try to understand the cumulative effect of that interaction. It's through this interplay, right? Humans adapt to their environments and are shaped by them, but also simultaneously humans shape their environments and contribute to landscape formation. And so this is what results in what we see around the world today, or what many might see as natural environments. Again, even though they're anthropogenic. And so historical ecologists have recognized humans have had worldwide influences and affect landscapes in many different ways. And they would say this holistic perspective is really critical. You can't look at just one factor, the society or the ecology. You have to understand how they interact over time and the cumulative effects of that. And some of you sort of touch on this in your answers too. Good job. And so historical ecology has shown it's not just the Amazon that has anthropogenic landscapes. It's not just the Amazon in which humans have been adapting to their environment as well as adapting, modifying, and creating their environments. This has been happening all over the earth for a really long time, actually. The main point is that many people in the Western developed world, the way we conceive of nature and thus conservation and how to save nature, it's flawed. It's based off these Western assumptions that don't apply to the vast majority of human history. Humans have long been part of their environments of nature. They could be considered themselves nature, right? We've been modifying human environments throughout our existence for over 2 million years. Some environments that we think of as entirely pristine, wild, I'm talking about Lion King shit, are actually entirely anthropogenic. And so there's this excellent book by Adams and McShane. It was actually written a while ago, 1992, called The Myth of Wild Africa. And it sort of points out the pitfalls in conservation of people coming over these flawed assumptions that humans are somehow not part of their environments. And in order to protect these environments, we have to get the people out. Not only has it not necessarily been as productive for conservation as it could have been, more on that after the exam, but it's also disenfranchised a lot of people. So just real quick, one example. There's a great TED Talk, and I don't have the specifics for you right now, but it's about desertification in the grasslands in Africa. And what happened is certain areas, they set up national parks and they kick the people and their cattle out. Well, the grasslands in Africa are part of the overall ecology that's all evolved sort of throughout mutual interaction over time. And one thing about the grasslands there is they required actually herd animals to trample through and then move on to germinate. The grasses have to be all knocked down, and this happens when the herds come through, trample, feed for a while, and then move on as a predator comes and chases them off. And that's typical of these African savannas, right? You have large sort of herd animals and also key predatory apex species. And so they chase the herds off. This tramples down the grass. It allows it to germinate, get enough sunlight, and then it regenerates. The grasslands regenerate each year. So with some of these national parks that they've established in these areas, and they kick the people and the cattle out, well, what's happening now is the land is desertifying. because the grasses aren't regenerating because they're not getting trampled on. And so they're just dying, resulting in less and less vegetation, less and less nutrients in the soil, and literally desertification is occurring in these areas in the name of conservation. So a couple other examples, sort of talking about historical ecology and which would inform the myth of wild Africa. It's a myth because Africa is not wild and untouched. Humans have been part of the landscape for over 2 million years. They go through all these different case studies to illustrate this. One of the case studies is about the Serengeti. Save the Serengeti, right? Think the Lion King and these large-scale wildebeest and animal migrations, like the epitome of natural, right? Animals, the flora, the fauna, people aren't part of it. Well, these large-scale animal migrations on the Serengeti that people have set out a whole movement to save from people are a result of human activity. Specifically in Africa, there's different pastoral groups. Pastoralists are people that live off herd animals like cattle or llama. It depends on the region they're in. And so pastoralists have a long history in this region in the Serengeti of burning brush to get rid of the tsetse fly, which feeds and infects their herd animals. Through this burning of the brush for human purposes, it cleared up these migration routes for these large-scale animal migrations. That is human modified. Another example, in Solomon Islands, there's a great book called Islands of Rainforest. It's actually all about, it's a historical ecologist that sort of writes about it and an anthropologist. And in the Solomons, it's rainforest. There's an archipelago of hundreds of different islands, beautiful rainforest on each island. And what they talk about in the piece, Islands of Rainforest, is that this is actually secondary growth. This is human modified. It wouldn't look like this if humans hadn't been cultivating and growing and doing things in the forest for their own subsistence for several generations. Kind of a more interesting along the same lines, also, if you go to the Solomon Islands today, along the coast of all the islands grow tons of coconut trees. And now they grow coconuts and then export. It's called copra exports. So coconut, and they export it for oil and all sorts of other things. About 200, 300 years ago, or even less, if you went to the Solomon Islands, there would be no coconut trees along the coast. It wouldn't look like this sort of tropical paradise along the coast. And there also wouldn't be people settled along the coast fishing as they are today. Everyone actually lived further inland because in Solomon Islands, they practice something called headhunting. And so remember, Solomon Islands is diverse, over 80 different indigenous languages there today, not to mention how many there probably were in the past. And so you have all these different competing groups that don't necessarily get along. Well, part of the beliefs and practices in the supernatural, which we would subsume religion, witchcraft, and magic under, part of their beliefs and practices in the supernatural revolve around a concept similar to manna. And if you've heard of manna, it's like spiritual energy that can reside in people, to give them power, whatever. I'm speaking overly general. And so in Solomon Islands, people would go headhunting. They'd go on raids and try to capture the heads of their enemy villages and bring them back to the village. Now, the thinking goes that some parts of the body are more important than others. If you get your finger chopped off, you're probably going to be fine. But if you get your head chopped off, that's probably it. And so they've reasoned that the spiritual energy, again, it has to do with their beliefs. It's beyond the purview of this example. The most of the spiritual energy resides in the head. And you can't increase your own mana. You have a limited amount, as does your village. So the only way to increase one's spiritual power is to capture the mana of others, which you can do through headhunting. And so prior to colonialism by the British, no one lived on the coasts because you couldn't protect yourself from marauding headhunters. Everyone lived in the interior. In fact, the island of Gizo, where Titiana and Pailange are on, that was completely uninhabited until British colonialism because it's small. It's like 4 by 6 miles and a really low elevation. So no one lived there. No one colonized it because you couldn't protect yourselves from headhunters. This is also why the British set up shop on Gizo, because it was uninhabited. And so back to the coconut trees, it's only with colonialism, with the pacification of headhunting via the colonists and also missionaries, headhunting ended and people began living near the coasts for different reasons, and one of which was because they began growing coconuts and harvesting coconuts for copra production to export for the British. And so again, if you go to Solomon's today, it looks a certain way. It didn't look that way 200 years ago. Both look what we might consider nature in the Western world, and both are affected by humans. Okay, so the book sort of goes through a bunch of examples. One other example I'll give you real quick. They talk about elephants. Save the elephants, right? There was a talk given at SDSU, a Greenlove talk several years ago by this guy, Lynn. And he had worked for the military, and he was all about conservation, kind of in the vein I've been talking about, though. This idea, people are the problem, keep them out, set up national parks. And he told everyone this story about when he was younger and how all these elephants were shot in Africa. It's called culling of the population. And what had happened is the elephant population had exploded. Elephants require like 1,000 square miles of woodland just to forage. It's literally medium scale ecological destruction when they move around these areas. And so if also there's people living in some of these areas with gardens, elephants crop raid, they destroy entire livelihoods. And so there's a balance between how many elephants and how many people live in the area. Well, early decades ago, Western outsiders came in and said, don't you kill any elephants. They are protected now. With this conservation policy put in place by outsiders that did not understand the local ecology, the elephant population exploded just exponentially. And the result of that was they actually ended up having to cull the population so that the elephants didn't destroy everything else in the region, because the population had gotten so out of control because they were being protected from being killed. And so what this guy didn't mention is his talk, he's talking about how horrible, how these elephants were shot with machine guns from helicopters, and it is really sad. But what he failed to fucking mention is the reason that people were in this situation and having to shoot elephants from helicopters was because of their conservation policies that they put in place to save the elephants. Right? It's complicated. There aren't simple solutions to complex problems, and people offering simple solutions like build a fence between them and us offer no solution at all. A couple of excerpts from The Myth of Wild Africa to wrap this up. Countless African societies historically coexisted successfully with wild animals, but throughout the last 2 centuries they have been perceived as threats. African hunters have been branded as poachers, a word value-laden with judgments about who the supposed heroes and villains of conservation are. One more. European explorers wanted to believe in a virgin land unsullied by human hands. Yet this Africa never was. Indeed, nowhere does this vision of Africa depart further from reality. Man, meaning human, has been an integral part of the African landscape for over 2 million years. The people that lived in Africa, however, was irrelevant to the West. What mattered was the wilderness. Wild Africa was considered so important, in fact, people in Europe and North America organized a movement to save it. Human impact on the environment. Degradation is not a human universal. It is culturally specific. Okay, a few other things. And so let's talk a minute about resource management, property regimes and resource management. So property regimes are important social institutions underlying resource management. When I say a social institution, it doesn't necessarily mean a government or a company. It means an organized group or a cooperative. It could be, the institution could be a local village, for example, but some sort of organized group that manages the resource. That's the property regime. So a key question is, well, what is property? And in the West, we've sort of collapsed it into things like it's land or resources or my car or this or that. But that's not the only form of property. Property is not just things or objects. That's one form of property. What about intellectual property? The right to your idea, or the right to walk across the street, the right to change lanes on the freeway. And so where we're going with this is property is it's a relationship. It's relational. It's the relationship of persons to things. It's not just the thing. And if this is vague now, hang in there. It's a social relationship. Property is not a thing. It's a social relationship. It could be a right. It can be an idea or a tangible thing. It doesn't have to be an object. Again, it's how people relate to objects or ideas. So an example to illustrate what I mean by this property is relational. We think of it as things, but it's not. So think about like you're driving and the right to change lanes or merge onto the freeway, or cross the crosswalk on a busy street. So the property regime and the resource are not the same thing. In this case, the resource is maybe the road, or yeah, the road. Um, the property, though, whose property is it? This is a relationship. Who owns the road, the resource, or the right to use it at that time depends on the signal in this case. It's contextual. It's sort of my right if the light is green for me, but you're right if it's not, right? This is what we mean when we say it's relational. It's the relationship of people to things. Um, it also depends on cultural norms or customs. So like if you're trying to, if say there's two lanes on the freeway merging into one, and typically the sort of informal custom is you let one car goes from the left, one car goes from the right, and we all merge into one lane. But sometimes people are dicks and they cut ahead, right? And we notice it when they don't follow the rules, right? Because they're not following the rules. They violated the relationship, right? It was sort of your turn. It was your right. So that's what we mean when we say it's relational rather than just things. So the right to fish in a certain area, the right to use resources in a certain area. These are also examples of property and property regimes. So there's four basic types of property regimes, and this will come back up after the exam. I introduce it to you now because it's sort of leading us into our next major topic of the course, which is conservation policy. So four basic types of property regimes. The first is open access regimes. So this is when access to the resource is unregulated and it's free and open to everyone. Good examples of this, like maybe really large tracts of grassland that even if you want to manage and technically have the right to, it's almost impossible to do so, right? Because it's too big, you can't really tell when it's being used. Or other examples, oceans, right? The ocean, deep sea fisheries. Now, I realize that there's a lot of regulations that go into that, but when you get far enough out into some of these pelagic fisheries, there's no real way to actually monitor that, right? So it makes the resource, in essence, open access because there's no real property regime or institution managing that, at least not in an effective way. It's either too difficult or too expensive to actually regulate the resource, which makes it, in effect, open access. It's open to everyone. Oceans are an example. Deep sea fisheries, again, impossible to actually regulate. With caveats, I realize the global atmosphere is another example, right? We're all allowed to sort of, at least for now, pollute into it. It's an open access resource. You go burn some shit outside right now, no one's going to stop you. You can go pollute into it. It's an open access resource. Even if people don't want you to or there's a rule, they're not really going to be able to stop you. Open access. Okay, common property regimes. Um, Institutions that manage resources collectively. And again, an institution is not necessarily an organization or a company or a government. It's a group, a collective, organized group of people in some way. Like a co-op could be a common property regime, people that all have access to like a garden or something like that. The lakeshore villages around Lake Titicaca, the fishing villages you've been reading about in Orlov, Nature and Culture at Lake Titicaca, these communities have what we call common property regimes. Each community has something called community-based resource management. It's called TERFs in the book, territorial use rights in fishing. Each community in around the village, each fishing village has tenure over part of the sea, over the water. And there's no lines actually drawn in it, but everyone knows where the boundaries are and you respect the other village's boundaries. You don't fish in their waters and they don't fish in yours. It's a common property regime. So the whole group sort of manages it collectively, right? Very different than sort of top down, you have one person telling everyone what to do. The Solomon Islands also have common property regimes, or surrounding fishing waters. So different villages have tenure, meaning rights to the garden land, and then the adjacent sea where they can go fish. And again, everyone knows whose territory is who, and they respect that. And if they don't, there's repercussions to that. And so it's a group, an institution, a collective of people that are managing the resource. And so importantly, again, the resource type and the property regime are not the same thing. In this case, we could be talking about fish. The fish is the resource in Lake Titicaca, the lake, but it's managed by a common property regime. And that means the resource is not open access. In other examples, you can have other fish populations in the deep sea, and it's not really regulated by anyone. And so it ends up being an open access property regime. Okay, two other types. There's also private property regimes. This is when we're familiar with this one. This is when individuals or corporations have vested rights to exclude others from using the resources. They get to regulate who gets to use it and who doesn't. Good examples of private property regimes, logging companies, mining companies that buy up the rights to certain tracts of land or the resource, and then it's theirs to use and exploit however they see fit. And then lastly, we have state property regimes, government regulated, nationalized. This is where the rights to the resource are vested in the government. Examples of this: are you allowed to just go fishing or hunting anytime you want? No. Wild game and fish populations, these resources are under a state property regime, meaning the government regulates access to them. You have to go buy a license if you want to go fishing or hunting. Bureau of Land Management, BLM land, is another state property regime. Basically, the government has claimed different tracts of land all over the country as BLM land, meaning it's theirs, they say. It belongs to them. I got a citation on their land once. Story for another day. Okay, and so the villages around Lake Titicaca represent a common property regime. They well, first, let me back up. They represent a common property regime, and it's sort of conveyed by this acronym TERFs, which means Territorial Use Rights in Fishing. Again, it refers to each village has sort of a part of the sea that's adjacent to where their village is, and it belongs to them. It's their territory. Only they can fish in it. And they don't go to other villages' waters either. Likewise, other villages don't try to fish in their waters. Everyone respects the boundaries. And so meanings of lines in the water, the title of the book, it could refer to sort of TERFs, these territorial use rights, these lines, these boundaries in the fishing territory. It could refer to the fishing lines in the water. Different meanings sort of might come from that. I'll leave you to think about it. And so in the ethnography that we've been reading about these villagers, it's not a textbook, it's more of a story. And one of the reasons we're reading it is ethnography is a hallmark tool in anthropology. It takes a holistic approach. If you want to actually understand what's going on in a society or an environment, go there, right? Ask people, talk to them, observe for yourself. Don't just create assumptions and apply what you think's going on, because you're going to be wrong. And so in the villages around Lake Titicaca, how do the resource users regulate access? And again, it's this thing called TERFs. They have tenure to territory on the land in the adjacent sea, and it belongs to them. And everyone sort of knows that. Outsiders are not allowed to come in. There's all sorts of different sort of outsiders as you read through the book. The Navy at one point tries to regulate the fishing villages. The government does. They bring in some biology and fishery experts to try and regulate or figure out what's going on, make sure that Lake Titicaca remains sustainable, because outsiders are interested in making sure that the environment here is not degraded, because Lake Titicaca is such a unique region. It's an ancient lake. It has a fish flock of fish that exists nowhere else in the world really except for Lake Titicaca. So it's a really unique ecology. And so you have all these scientists and experts and outsiders. We got to come in and make sure, they're not degrading the resources, and what are the villagers doing? even though all the while the villagers are interacting sustainably with their environments, right? They're not over exploiting it. And how are they excluded? It's not really with formal rules, it's community enforcement, something called community-based resource management. When people try to come in, they get kicked out, either with threats or sometimes violence. Even social stigma is sometimes enough to keep people from doing it. There's an example in the book when the government tries to introduce fishing licenses, tries to get people to register so that the government can track who's fishing. But some of the people that got licenses thought, well, now I have this thing from the government that says I can fish wherever, so now I can go into other communities' territory. People tried this, but it didn't work out. The other villages said, get the fuck out. It's community-based resource management. And it's a really unique, rare example in which, in the face of repeated external pressures and outsiders coming in, the local villagers have actually managed to retain local control over their resources. Again, this is something called community-based resource management. We'll be talking a lot more about that after the exam. And so TERFs is a type of community-based resource management. Just a few more things before we wrap up for the day. And in community-based resource management, of which TERFs is a type, the resource use, the fish in the lake in this case, is controlled by the actual resource users, the people that live there and live off that environment, the actual local community. Question is, why is this weird to us? Why would many of us in the Western world assume this wouldn't work? Our government would never say sort of, hey, everyone, all you in California, here's a lake. Now all of you can use it. What's the assumption that will happen? And the assumption is that people generally assume resource degradation is inevitable if everyone has access. So the assumption is you have to convert common property, commons, things that everyone has access to, into either private property or government regulations are instituted to protect the resource. That's the assumption. If you let people use it and they're not regulated, they will inevitably overexploit it. It's the tragedy of the commons, which we'll talk about after the exam. The thinking that's come from that is we have to convert it to private property or regulate it by the government. And this is simply untrue. In many cases, Western outsiders, scientists, experts have simply overlooked the capacity for community-based resource management because it's practically invisible to them. It doesn't look like what they think of when they think of management. There's one example from your reading, pages 136 to 37, maybe to 38. And it talks about this fisheries, this biologist expert they brought in to introduce trout into Lake Titicaca to try to increase economic output. And so what an asshole. Let me just read an excerpt from this book about this expert that came to tell the locals how to take care of their lake. The government commission hired James, this is the fisheries expert, to spend 6 months to study the lake in detail. He would need to travel extensively, go to all these different areas, Although James received payment for the full period, he stayed only 1 month, not 6. His report was 18 pages long. That's shorter than some of your term papers. And it was briefer than many had expected. Nor were his arguments very sophisticated. He said Lake Titicaca reminded him of the Great Lakes of the United States and Canada, so he recommended bringing in fish that were found there. This is a fisheries expert. Even a cursory glance would have revealed major differences that not the same at all. James also failed to examine the social and economic dimensions of the fisheries. Completely unaware of village control of fishing grounds, he stated that the fishermen are disorganized and individualistic. Who does that sound like? He proposed a continuous patrolling by a large number of boats to make sure that the local fishermen would follow his suggested restrictions on gear, fishing season, and the size of the fish that were caught. Because he's such an expert, right? An 18-page paper, he spent a month and got paid for 6 months. He didn't do anything. And this happens time and time again. More powerful outsiders come in paternalistically, assuming they know best, and it often destroys what's going on locally to the detriment of the environment and the local resource users. And so this example of TERFs in Ben Orlov, this example of community-based resource management, is one alternative to privatization or government regulation that works in some cases. And the other thing is, private property has not instilled sustainable resource use. Think about mining and logging companies. That's private property. And government regulations haven't either. In fact, our current administration under Donald Trump has removed 60 or something out of 80 environmental regulations to protect us. Not like shit like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. So privatization and government reg have not ensured sustainability either. And CBRM is one alternative that works in certain cases. In order for CBRM to work, to be effective, it does have to have certain characteristics in place. And this is the last thing we'll touch on. And the point of this slide is not to ask you, which of the following are characteristics of CBRM, but just to show you that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. Certain things have to be in place for this to actually work. And it tends to be more conducive with small-scale societies because they know each other, because they interact with each other on a daily basis, which facilitates these necessary characteristics that I'm going to mention. And so actually the person that was responsible for identifying these necessary characteristics for it to work, her name was Elinor Ostrom, and she was actually a political economist, but she said when she accepted a Nobel Prize in 2009 for identifying factors that lead to successful community-based resource management, which is also often called the commons. She's a political economist, but she said when she accepted the Nobel Prize that she really considers herself an anthropologist. So, yay. The institution that awarded her basically pointed out that Ostrom brought CBRM to the forefront. She showed that common resources, forests, fisheries, oil fields, grazing lands, can be managed successfully by the people that use them, rather than being managed by governments or private companies. And so she really challenged the conventional wisdom of the time. She showed common pooled resources can be successfully managed by the people that use them. She died in 2012. And so what are these characteristics that she points out? And again, I'm not going to ask you to list these. Just know that certain things need to be in place. And we'll talk more about this after the exam. First, there needs to be easily defined boundaries. This is true in Lake Titicaca. Everyone knows where each village's territory is. It can't be ambiguous. It has to be clear so users can respect them. There needs to be equitable costs and benefits for all members involved. So the benefits of the system have to be spread out so everyone gets some of it, and the costs have to be spread out too. To sort of ensure that this happens, you need participatory management and/or decision-making by all stakeholders, meaning that everyone involved gets to have a say, gets to be involved in what happens. There has to be a capacity to monitor if people start violating the rules or going where they're not supposed to. There has to be a way to monitor that. Otherwise, it really does become essentially open access. So you need to be able to monitor others' use, make sure the rules are being respected. This is one reason why it tends to be conducive to small-scale societies, because small-scale societies are typically already subsistence-based, face-to-face, everyone knows everyone, and so a lot of these necessary characteristics are very easy to build into the way the society is already structured. There needs to be a way to enforce the decisions that are made by the group. Often in a small-scale society, the cultural stigmatization that comes with not sort of falling in line is usually enough. If not, there's more formal ways to punish people if necessary. So there has to be a way to resolve conflicts, to mediate or solve disputes, or again, punish if necessary. And users also need formal or informal means to secure tenure and rights over that resource. So it could be informal tenure, like how it is among Lake Titicaca, right? Everyone knows where the boundaries are and who's allowed to use it. Or it could be more formal and sort of written down. And then, again, one of the reasons often community-based management is overlooked by outsiders and Westerners and scientists coming in to help people is because it's more informal. It's invisible to them almost. They don't see it because it doesn't look like what we do when we supposedly manage stuff. Okay, so we'll talk more about community-based resource management after the exam. It's an alternative to other conservation strategies that have been problematic, as we'll see. So you have the exam starting Thursday. You have until Sunday. Study guide's up. I told you which question is going to be asked from the essay questions. And so if you have questions, shoot me an email, jump on the discussion board. Depending on student interest, maybe we can do a study session by Zoom or something like that too. So stay in touch with me. Let me know how you're doing. I tried to make the exam honestly just a little bit easier for you. So prepare your essay in advance, study for the exam. And then after that, we have 2 short sections left of the class. Really only 6 or 7 lectures left. Conservation and resource management, which will be really interesting, and then sustainability in the local San Diego region, which I think you'll also like. So with that, good luck with everything. Stay in touch with me, and I will talk to you soon.